Greetings, YouTube. I realize I actually haven't spoken about how I handled Myth Drannor once in an old campaign. This was a second edition campaign that was on the cusp of third edition, and when third edition was released, I converted the game over to that, on the fly. Not on the fly. We did it properly and everything, but the game made a transition because I wanted to try the new rule system. But we all like the same characters, so I just kind of massaged them, and we made it work. And I like Faerun, the setting of Faerun, not because of like necessarily the politics and stuff. I do use some of the NPCs, of course, because it's just handy, because you've got all the rulers and the major NPCs, if you want to use them, already written up for you, so it's it's very convenient. I like the maps. It was big enough maps, and there was enough empty spaces that I could put what I wanted to put there, because I always added my own towns and important places, and this particular group founded their own town at one point. Blackstar, was it the Blackstar? Because they were the companions of the Crystal Star. That's right, Crystal Dale. Like that. No, was it Crystal Dale? I can't remember. They named themselves something like that. But I didn't run it exactly the way the history was, because Myth Drannor in the traditional is this wasteland, this ruins of demon infested place, and it's not a place where people go except to make forays in and do adventuring. But by and large, it's no longer an extant entity. The peoples that lived there were wiped out. At least if my memory is serving me correctly. But in my version, Myth Drannor found itself, it was an elven kingdom, a very powerful one, and it found itself being inundated with demonic beings. Undefined demonic, extra-dimensional kind of things. I wasn't entirely specifically, was it devils, was it demons? Things from beyond the realm, outsiders that wanted to, feast on your souls and eat your babies and things like that. And there was a lot of them, and they were overwhelming the elven peoples who had not been prepared for this particular kind of an assault. The baddies were able to establish a beachhead essentially, and it made getting rid of them difficult. And the Elven Kingdom put out a call and asked for the communities around it, the kingdoms and territories around it, for assistance. Now, they were a powerful elven culture, and as elves can be, they can sometimes look down their nose at those who are younger races, who are maybe less technically savvy, who have a little less culture. So there was a little bit of bad blood between them and all the humans and non-human races in the territory. So pretty much no nation stepped forward. There were individual groups and some religion sent peoples, but no nation stepped forward and said, yes, we are going to help you, except for Cormyr. And Cormyr, for whatever reason, I don't remember what the reason was, they said, yes, you are our neighbors, you are in need, we will help you. And they invaded the territory and struck the demonic beings or extra-dimensional outsiders. So it became a two-pronged war, and that eventually drove them back, and they were able to close the gate, get rid of them, wipe them out. And of course, lingering things popped up from occasion to occasion in Myth Drannor forever, of course, just because that's fun for, GMs and storylines and things like that. But they won. And because they won, the kingdom never collapsed. So jump forward in time to the era of the campaign. This had all take place in the past. And the kingdom was still present. It was still a major power. They were much more militant than they have been in the past. And they still had a rather negative opinion about the kingdoms and things around them, except for Cormyr. And if pretty much everyone from Cormyr had right of passage to go there and to visit, and if you were of the lineage of those who had fought for Myth Drannor, if you could trace your bloodline back, and they kept accurate records of this because they're long-lived, anal retentive, and they're good at this, you had the right of residency. So you could show up and say, I declare my right. It's kind of like if you're Jewish, you can live in Israel, kind of thing. That's the same kind of vibe here. Um, if you could trace your lineage, you could live in Myth Drannor if you chose. You would be surrounded by elves, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at the elves and how much you want to be immersed in their culture, leaving yours behind. And that only really came up once when the player characters found themselves in a situation where they had discovered a major curse had been placed on a family line, and the only two members left had retreated to Myth Drannor because they had been driven out of Cormyr because of the curse. And the curse had been laid upon them, and for like 200 years, their family had just been being beaten by fate over time. Like every time there was a possible thing in this family line that could go good or bad, they always get hit with the bad one. And it whittled their family's fortune down to there was nothing. They lost their lands, and finally it was just two people left. And it was a father and his adult daughter, and they just retreated there, and they were going to like, okay, we give up. We can't keep our territory. We can't. They had titles but no lands, and their titles were kind of empty. And eventually the player characters figured out this curse was, and they figured out how to break it. And they had to go to Myth Drannor to talk to these people. So they had to get like the proper kind of permissions and things. Fortunately for the group, one of the player characters was a half-elf whose father was, unbeknownst to them, at least initially, part of an intelligence agency. He had been passing himself off as a trader, not like as a turncoat, but a trader, a guy who traveled on and traded, wheeler and dealer and things like that. And that's how he had fallen in love with a human woman and had a child, and that was one of the player characters. So this kid was raised by his mother. They were well taken care of financially, and the father would just stop in periodically because, again, he was on this trade route that made it very easy for him to gather intelligence for the elves. So they were able to get passage, so to especially get a visa that let them go to Myth Drannor and say, hey, we're looking for these people. Can you help us? We need to convey this message to them that will aid them. And when they got that visa, and it was properly filled out and all that crap, and when they realized that they were actually going to help someone who had helped them, the elves extended their graciousness and let them in and let them see them. They helped break the curse, and when that happened, the family that had cursed them suddenly had retroactive misfortune, and they lost almost everything, and the land and the titles and everything just kind of everything reset itself. So they didn't get everything back, but they got their lands, they got damages. They were once again landed gentry as opposed to just landless and kind of hollow title kind of thing. And of course the player characters got a reward, and I think they may have even been bestowed with some titles. They weren't high-ranking titles. I think they were already lords and ladies at that point in the campaign. But they got some more titles attached on there, and I think they even got a vacation home out of it or something like that. But so the elves. Sorry, I was all over the place on this one, but that's okay. So Myth Drannor, not only was it a powerful nation, but they were the first nation to utilize spelljammers, but they were just sky ships, and so they'd been passing them off as sky ships, airships, and things like that. But everyone thought they were just airships, sky ships. They didn't realize they were capable of leaving the planet. They thought they were atmospheric, vessels that needed air and things like that. They didn't realize most people were not aware that you could leave the planet. So they thought it was an air force, essentially, just like fairly slow moving. There were some faster ships. For the most part, it was just fairly slow. And eventually there was a major war as people began to just beat Cormyr to death. And when this happened, Cormyr asked for aid from Myth Drannor. And Myth Drannor was like, oh, you'd like our help? I mean, we can finally repay you for how your people helped us? Yeah, no problem. And one night, they just sent their entire air force out at night and destroyed the entire blockading navy that had been preventing the Cormyrean navy from getting out of their bay. I mean, it's like the next morning, the sun rose, and there was no army. There was no enemy navy left. Not a vessel was alive, and no one knew what the hell happened because they weren't expecting ships to come out of the sky at night and just blow them out of the water. And it showed people just how dangerous the elves could be if they wanted to. And suddenly, people were a lot nicer to the elves, but the elves didn't want to expand. They weren't aggressive. They just made it very clear that you don't mess with us and you don't mess with us, our ally. And at the moment, the only ally they had, at least in this vicinity, was Cormyr. And so that really even cemented the relationship with those two nations even further. But that's how I used Myth Drannor in that campaign, and I loved it. Yes, they were the hand of God, ex machina, but I liked them anyway. I thought they were cool, and I never really used it to depth because, except for that one character in the group who was half-elf, the group didn't have a lot of connections to the elven culture, really. I mean, they'd bump into elves regularly on a one-to-one basis, but they never really, none of the adventures really went in that direction, so they never got involved in the intrigues, the politics and stuff of Myth Drannor. The possibility was there, but it just never really happened because that's not the direction the campaign went in. But I always liked that idea that I had this kingdom that I could use at will, and they were not expansionistic, so no one was at risk from them, but also they were dangerous and they were advanced. They just did their own thing and they were happy about it. But they learned their lesson. Don't let your guard down because the enemy can come from anywhere. And hold your friends close because there aren't a lot of them in the world. And when you need them and they come to your aid, cherish them forever. So, blathering on for long enough for this particular video, that's how I use Myth Drannor. So now tell me, have anyone of you out there used Myth Drannor from the Faerun setting in your campaigns, and how did you use it? Obviously, I went left field with my version. It had nothing to do really with the official storyline except for the name, and it was an elven culture. That was it. That's the similarities. Everything else I changed from that point forward, and I'm okay with that. I don't mind that at all. But tell me if you ever have adventured there. Have you ever heard of it before? Am I talking out of my butt? Have you never heard of this particular kingdom before from that particular setting? I think it was pretty fairly well known, so anyone that played in the setting should at least be familiar with the name. So yeah, let's talk about Myth Drannor, how you've used it, how you've adventured with it, and do you find any merit in what I did?